This isn't about fuel prices or refinery supply. It's about forcing a realignment and daring adversaries to respond. I have learned over decades in intelligence that when an offer is framed as generosity but structured as control, it is neither. It is leverage. When I saw the announcement that Venezuela would turn over between 30 and 50 million barrels of oil to the United States, described publicly as a move to help both American consumers and the Venezuelan people, my first reaction was not economic curiosity, but analytic alarm. Nothing about this deal makes sense if relief is the objective. Everything about it makes sense if narrative management and geopolitical positioning are the goals. 30 to 50 million barrels sounds impressive until you place it in context. The world consumes roughly 100 million barrels of oil per day. The United States alone burns close to 20 million barrels daily. What is being offered amounts to 2 or 3 days of U.S. consumption delivered over an undefined timeline under U.S. control, sold at market prices, and tightly conditioned on political compliance. That is not energy relief. That is symbolism dressed up as substance. Intelligence officers are trained to strip away scale illusions, and once you do, the economic argument collapses immediately. The timing matters as much as the volume. This offer arrives amid sustained sanctions pressure, political instability in Caracas, and open U.S. demands that Venezuela sever ties with China, Russia, Iran, and Cuba. From an intelligence perspective, this is not a commercial transaction. It is a conditional surrender mechanism. Oil is being used as a compliance token, not as a resource meant to stabilize markets. The public framing pretends otherwise because the real objective cannot be sold honestly. I also pay attention to who controls execution. When energy flows are placed under U.S. supervision, when the oil is not gifted but sold, and when the deal is presented as a test of loyalty rather than capacity, you are no longer in the realm of economics. You are in the realm of coercive diplomacy. That distinction matters because it determines outcomes. Coercion produces resistance, hedging, and counteralignment. Relief produces cooperation. Washington keeps confusing the two. The intelligence failure here is basic but recurring. Analysts and policymakers are treating narrative acceptance as strategic success. They assume that announcing control equals exercising power. In reality, every actor watching this deal understands what it is: a signal that U.S. access to resources is now openly transactional and politically conditional. That message travels far beyond Venezuela. The hard lesson, which Washington refuses to internalize, is that credibility erodes not through weakness alone, but through transparent manipulation. When intelligence becomes a prop for selling deals that do not withstand scrutiny, strategy collapses into theater. I watched sanctions policy metastasize over the last 2 decades from a tactical pressure tool into a substitute for strategy, and nowhere has that corrosion been more damaging than inside the intelligence process itself. Sanctions are supposed to shape behavior by altering cost calculations. What they have actually done repeatedly is reshape intelligence reporting to justify policies already chosen. Venezuela is a textbook case of that institutional decay. Once sanctions become the centerpiece of policy, intelligence stops being an instrument of discovery and becomes a mechanism of validation. Analysts learn quickly which conclusions are rewarded and which ones die quietly in coordination meetings. In the Venezuelan file, the incentives were clear. Reports that emphasized regime fragility, imminent economic collapse, or public desperation were elevated. Assessments that noted regime resilience, alternative trading networks, or the adaptive capacity of state oil structures were sidelined. That was not accidental, it was structural. Sanctions create bureaucratic pressure to demonstrate progress. Intelligence officers are asked not whether sanctions are working, but how close they are to working. That framing contaminates analysis. Data points get selected to support a narrative of pressure success rather than to measure real-world effects. Over time, this produces a distorted picture in which policymakers believe they are tightening a vice when in reality They are teaching the target how to survive under constraint. In Venezuela, sanctions accelerated the fragmentation of oil logistics but did not eliminate production. They pushed transactions into opaque channels, strengthened non-Western intermediaries, and reduced transparency. From an intelligence standpoint, that is a failure. Reduced visibility is not leverage, it is blindness. Yet sanctions advocates consistently reported declining state capacity as evidence of impending collapse, even as parallel systems expanded beyond U.S. monitoring. This distortion fed directly into the oil deal narrative. Intelligence assessments emphasized Venezuelan desperation rather than Venezuelan bargaining power. They understated the regime's alternatives and overstated U.S. leverage. As a result, policymakers convinced themselves that conditional oil access would force strategic realignment. That belief rests on corrupted analysis. When a state has already adapted to sanctions for years, incremental relief does not buy loyalty. It buys time. The strategic consequence is predictable. Washington negotiates from a position it imagines rather than one it occupies. Deals are structured around compliance fantasies instead of adversary incentives. Intelligence becomes reactive, explaining why expectations failed rather than preventing failure in the first place. The hard lesson is uncomfortable, but unavoidable. Sanctions do not just pressure adversaries. They pressure intelligence systems. When analysts are rewarded for reinforcing policy narratives, intelligence ceases to be intelligence. It becomes fiction with footnotes, and strategy built on that foundation will always collapse under contact with reality. One of the most persistent analytical failures in Washington is the refusal to recognize when a country has ceased to be a bilateral problem and has become a contested battle space. Venezuela crossed that threshold years ago, yet U.S. policy continues to treat it as a delinquent partner waiting to be corrected. From an intelligence perspective, that misclassification explains almost every strategic error that followed. Venezuela is not negotiating in isolation. Its oil sector sits at the intersection of Chinese financing, Russian technical support, Iranian logistics expertise, and Cuban intelligence assistance. These relationships did not emerge out of ideology alone. They formed because U.S. pressure systematically removed Western options. When analysts frame Venezuela as economically cornered but strategically isolated, they ignore the very networks sanctions helped consolidate. Oil, in this environment, is not a commodity. It is a terrain of competition. Control over production, refining compatibility, shipping routes, insurance mechanisms, and payment systems determines alignment more than formal diplomacy ever could. When the United States offers conditional access to its market while demanding the expulsion of rival powers, it is not offering partnership. It is proposing exclusivity in a system where exclusivity is no longer viable. Intelligence assessments repeatedly underestimated how much leverage Venezuela retains, precisely because it is embedded in multipolar energy flows. Heavy, sour crude, often dismissed as inconvenient, is actually valuable to specific refineries globally. Alternative buyers exist. Alternative financiers exist. Alternative security guarantors exist. The assumption that Caracas must choose between isolation and U.S. compliance reflects a unipolar mindset that no longer matches operational reality. The oil deal announcement exposes this failure starkly. By framing the transaction as a test of loyalty, Washington reveals that it sees Venezuela less as a sovereign actor and more as contested ground to be cleared of adversaries. That framing is not lost on observers in Beijing, Moscow, or Tehran, nor is it lost on regional governments who understand that today's interim authority is tomorrow's expendable asset. The strategic consequence is escalation without dominance. By treating Venezuela as a prize rather than a node, the United States incentivizes countermoves rather than cooperation. Rival powers respond not by withdrawing, but by deepening their footprint, hardening their positions, and increasing the cost of reversal. Intelligence reporting then interprets this resistance as proof of malign influence rather than as a predictable response to coercive design. The hard lesson Washington refuses to absorb is that battle spaces cannot be managed through transactional announcements. When intelligence fails to map the full competitive environment, policy mistakes positioning for power. What follows is not alignment, but prolonged contest under worsening conditions. One of the most durable myths in U.S. energy policy is the idea that symbolic oil volumes can be translated into strategic relief through repetition and messaging. I have watched this myth survive intelligence briefings, market data, and basic arithmetic, largely because it serves a political need rather than an analytical one. The Venezuelan oil deal is being sold as economic relief, but that claim collapses the moment you interrogate it with facts instead of headlines. Energy markets do not respond to gestures. They respond to sustained supply, predictable logistics, and credible governance. 30 to 50 million barrels, even if delivered without interruption, does not alter global pricing structures. It does not meaningfully affect refinery margins over time. It does not stabilize futures markets. Analysts who suggest otherwise are either ignoring scale or deliberately obscuring it. Intelligence officers are trained to recognize when numbers are being used performatively rather than operationally, and this is a textbook case. The heavy sour crude in question further undermines the relief narrative. Only specific U.S. refineries, primarily along the Gulf Coast, are configured to process it efficiently. Even then, integration requires stable transport, insurance coverage, and predictable regulatory conditions. None of those prerequisites are addressed by a politically conditional transfer controlled by the same authority imposing sanctions. Markets interpret uncertainty as risk, not relief. What this deal actually provides is a press-ready story. It allows policymakers to claim action on energy prices without confronting structural drivers like refinery capacity constraints, global demand growth, or geopolitical supply disruptions elsewhere. Intelligence assessments that focus narrowly on barrels transferred miss the more important variable, market confidence. Confidence cannot be coerced. It has to be earned through consistency. The strategic distortion here is familiar. Policymakers confuse movement with momentum. They believe that announcing oil flows creates leverage, when in reality it exposes fragility. Allies see the limits immediately. Adversaries see opportunity. Energy traders see noise. None of these audiences interpret the deal as relief. From an intelligence standpoint, the danger lies in feedback loops. When markets do not respond, officials blame execution rather than premise. Intelligence is then tasked with finding explanations that preserve the original narrative. Temporary price fluctuations are cited as success. Structural irrelevance is ignored. Over time, analysis bends to defend policy rather than to evaluate it. The hard lesson is blunt. Energy relief is not achieved through conditional transfers designed for political signaling. It is achieved through durable supply chains and credible policy. When intelligence fails to enforce that distinction, economic narratives become strategic liabilities and credibility erodes with every unmet promise. The most corrosive shift I witnessed over the course of my career was not ideological, but procedural. Intelligence stopped driving public statements, and public statements began driving intelligence. When policy is announced first and analysis is forced to catch up, assessment degrades into justification. The Venezuelan oil deal is a clean example of intelligence being subordinated to the press cycle. Serious intelligence work is slow, iterative, and skeptical. Press releases are immediate, declarative, and absolute. When leaders announce outcomes before conditions are secured, they create a demand for confirmation rather than evaluation. Analysts are then placed in an impossible position. Either they challenge the narrative and risk marginalization, or they contextualize it in ways that preserve plausibility. Over time, that choice stops feeling like a choice at all. In this case, the announcement of oil transfers, leadership, compliance, and geopolitical realignment preceded any verifiable change on the ground. Intelligence was not asked whether the deal altered Venezuelan incentives. It was asked how to explain why it would. That inversion matters. It turns intelligence into a supporting actor in a communication strategy rather than a tool of statecraft. Media amplification compounds the distortion. Once a claim is broadcast, walked back becomes impossible. Intelligence officers learn that contradicting a presidential statement does not refine policy, it creates friction. So assessments become carefully hedged, technically accurate but strategically misleading. Conditional language is buried, caveats are footnoted, headlines carry certainty that the underlying analysis does not support. This process produces what I came to think of as narrative momentum. The story moves forward regardless of facts because too many reputations are now attached to its success. Intelligence agencies are then judged not on accuracy, but on alignment. When outcomes fail to materialize, the failure is reframed as interference, sabotage, or bad faith by the target state, rather than as analytic misjudgment at home. The strategic consequence is institutional self-deception. Policymakers begin to believe their own messaging. They confuse repetition with validation. Intelligence, stripped of its corrective function, becomes an echo chamber with classified credentials. The oil deal narrative persists, not because it works, but because reversing it would require admitting that intelligence was never driving the process. The hard lesson is one intelligence professionals learn painfully and often too late. When strategy is announced before it is assessed, intelligence ceases to be a safeguard, it becomes a liability. States that practice intelligence by press release do not lose power overnight. They lose the ability to understand why they are losing it. Strategic blowback does not announce itself with headlines. It accumulates quietly in altered calculations, hedged commitments, and diminished trust. By the time policymakers acknowledge it, the damage is already embedded in the system. The Venezuelan oil deal has triggered that process, not hypothetically, but operationally, and the indicators are visible to anyone willing to look past the messaging. The first layer of blowback is credibility erosion. When the United States frames a politically conditional oil transfer as economic relief, allies understand the translation immediately. They see that access to markets is now openly contingent on compliance with U.S. geopolitical alignment. For states that depend on diversified partnerships to manage risk, that is not reassurance, it is a warning. Intelligence reporting from allied capitals consistently shows increased interest in hedging strategies precisely because Washington's commitments are perceived as transactional rather than structural. The second layer is adversary adaptation. China, Russia, and Iran do not interpret this deal as a loss. They interpret it as confirmation that U.S. leverage is being exercised at the margins rather than at the core. 30 to 50 million barrels does not threaten their energy security strategies. What it does is signal that Washington is willing to politicize supply chains overtly. That accelerates efforts to insulate trade, finance, and logistics from U.S. pressure. From an intelligence standpoint, that is strategic own goal behavior. Regionally, the consequences are already forming. Latin American governments observe how quickly legitimacy is conferred and withdrawn based on U.S. utility. That observation reinforces skepticism toward U.S. backed political transitions and increases the appeal of non-aligned or quietly multipolar postures. Intelligence officers tracking regional voting patterns, trade agreements, and defense cooperation see this shift clearly, even if it is rarely acknowledged publicly. There is also internal blowback. Intelligence agencies tasked with monitoring compliance are now bound to a narrative they did not design. When Venezuela inevitably maneuvers to preserve alternative relationships while extracting limited relief, the intelligence community will be asked to explain deviation as betrayal rather than as rational state behavior. That framing further corrodes analytic integrity and sets the stage for punitive escalation based on misread intent. The strategic consequence is cumulative loss of maneuver space. Each conditional deal narrows future options by hardening perceptions of U.S. behavior. Power becomes harder to exercise precisely because it is exercised too visibly and too often without durable results. The hard lesson is that blowback is not a policy failure you can correct later. It is the delayed cost of intelligence ignored at the outset. When narrative substitutes for strategy, consequences do not wait for permission to arrive. The final failure in this episode is not tactical or even strategic. It is epistemic. Washington no longer knows how to distinguish between leverage and control, between narrative compliance and real alignment. That confusion sits at the heart of the Venezuelan oil deal, and it explains why the same mistakes repeat regardless of administration, party, or declared doctrine. In intelligence work, power is measured by what you can reliably predict and shape, not by what you can announce. The oil deal reveals how far U.S. policy has drifted from that standard. Conditional access is mistaken for influence. Temporary acquiescence is misread as strategic shift. When outcomes fail to materialize, the failure is attributed to bad faith abroad rather than flawed assumptions at home. That cycle is not accidental. It is the product of institutions that have learned to protect narratives instead of interrogating them. The deeper problem is institutional self-preservation. Intelligence organizations now operate in an environment where challenging policy narratives carries professional risk while reinforcing them carries reward. Over time, this reshapes analysis itself. Assessments become cautious where they should be blunt, optimistic where they should be skeptical, and abstract where they should be concrete. Facts are still present, but they are arranged to soften impact rather than to drive correction. The Venezuelan case exposes this pathology clearly. Every serious intelligence indicator points to a state seeking maximum flexibility in a multipolar system, not permanent subordination to U.S. demands. Every energy market signal shows that the oil volumes involved are strategically marginal. Every regional trend suggests declining tolerance for overt coercion, yet policy proceeds as if announcement equals achievement. That is not miscalculation. It is willful blindness. The hard lesson Washington refuses to learn is that intelligence cannot save strategy if strategy refuses to listen. No amount of classified insight can compensate for leaders who value narrative dominance over analytic discipline. When intelligence is reduced to a storytelling tool, it loses its capacity to warn, to restrain, and to correct. What remains is motion without direction. I spent my career learning that the most dangerous failures are not surprises, they are outcomes everyone had the data to foresee but lacked the institutional courage to acknowledge. This oil deal fits that pattern precisely. It will not collapse dramatically. It will simply fade into the long record of initiatives that promise leverage and delivered erosion. When intelligence becomes fiction, credibility becomes collateral damage. And once credibility is spent, no volume of oil, no announcement, and no narrative can buy it back at market price.